Well, hello.
Hello.
Looks like things are working. Always nice when the technology behaves. Okay.
Yep. Carol, are you going to let us see you?
Hmm, hmm, hmm.
I have a young man fixing a dent in my car, so if I get up and leave, I'm going to pay him.
Okay. Not a problem. Let's see. I think we have 10 people we're expecting. Let me check the list real quick.
We're missing Nancy. Man, missing man.
So let's see here. Yeah, it should be 10. Okay. Well, we'll just give everybody a minute or two. Figure out the sign in.
Hi, Joanna.
You're back in your car.
But we can't hear you.
Yeah,
There,
I'm in between going to appointments, so
Ah, okay.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay, good.
Hmm.
Here's Bill. Hi.
Okay, we're little by little adding people. That.
I already told him that when I get a ding on my phone, I have to go
Oh,
pay. I have to
okay,
pay.
yeah.
Hi, Bill.
And see. Elena said,
Oh, hi, Elena.
there she is.
Prancing around.
Hi, Nancy.
Nan. Hi, Nan.
One, two, three, four, five, six, seven, eight. So just missing two. Hmm. 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 Well, there was one little housekeeping thing I should do straight away. I set it up so I don't have to remember to record class sessions. So it just starts it automatically when I jump in. But I want to make sure that's okay with everyone. That because I don't have to. It's just a convenience for other students or for you all if you want to rewatch class later. Okay.
Yeah.
Or if
Carol,
something comes up that there's a topic that comes up that you don't want that topic recorded at some point, we can always stop too, just to for particular periods of time if desired. So I just want to lay that out that you feel free to disrupt that program if it fits your needs.
yeah, I've been out of the witness protection program for a year, so I'm good.
You're okay? Okay.
I was thinking the girl might not know how to show her face.
Oh, can you tell her? Can she?
Carol, down at the bottom,
Yeah,
can you hear me?
yes, but we can't see you.
Down at the bottom, it
Yeah.
says stop video or start video,
Let me see. I can.
bottom left.
it, that stop video is for you personally, not to show up.
Right, but she might have one.
Oh, I see. I see. Yeah.
Oh, there you go. Wait a second, it went off. So we should see you. Carol.
Can you hear me?
We can
Yes.
hear
I hear
you.
you now.
Okay, I'm afraid of losing you altogether, so I'm just staring at you.
So you're not going to
Okay.
put your face up so we can see you?
I'm afraid something will go wrong.
Okay.
Okay. And Elena, all well on your end? We can't see you or hear you.
Me?
Helena.
Helen,
Oh,
Helena.
Elena's muted.
Yeah.
on her
Oh.
eye.
For now, we'll just have to assume everything is okay.
Elena, can you hear us? Are you there?
We can't
No.
hear her because she's muted.
Right, right.
There's something going on there. Well, anyway, okay, well, let's get rolling along. Welcome to class. This life. I was actually very intrigued by this book when I came across it.
He's 47. He's a
47.
baby. He's a baby.
He's a kid.
Huh.
But it's I have started to encounter things like this, that it's like, this is an idea I was trying to express, and I couldn't quite figure out how to do it cleanly, and he figured it out. And I ran across another example of this. I was picked up a book by I don't think I have it with me right now, by a rabbi I hadn't heard of, who was prominent Reform rabbi in the 50s and 60s. And he actually uses the line, God is the name of a feeling, which is something I thought I came up with.
Oh.
And lo and
Is it-
behold,
wait,
he
is
wrote it
it-
50 years before I even thought of it.
God is the name of a feeling, did you say, or
Yeah.
the feeling?
God is the name of a feeling,
The feeling.
as opposed to the cause of a feeling. So it's me playing with atheist constructions of language. But it just blew my mind that 50 years. So anyway, so I am now running into people who are ran into an English guy who also wrote a book, which I might do next term, which was very interesting. Another take on sort of how to think about religion if you're not actually interested in the God talk. But again, sort of this is like, that's the chapter in a book I wanted to write. And he's gone and written it before me. Oh, the life of an academic. Anyway, okay, so Martin Haggland, very interesting guy. Did you all have a chance to listen to the interview last week?
I didn't
Okay.
finish it, but I got 3/4 of the way.
Okay. Well, there were, I mean, as I go along with the interviews I found to show you, there's things that are going to repeat. So miss it 1 week, you might catch up with it. But that's also helpful because he comes at things from different directions, because the people asking the questions are coming from different perspectives. So I found it kind of interesting to combine them, and also I've organized them in a way that I think kind of illustrates the general flow of the book. So that the first ones are starting with topics that are the first part of the book, and the last one we'll get to is the topics from the last part of the book. So I think I have a good flow for it that will give you a really good feeling for what it is that he's up to in this idea that he's building that he calls secular faith. So before we actually get to that, maybe a little bit of on that would be helpful. So let's see, what did I say here? Okay, so what he calls a religious faith is any form of belief in an eternal being or an eternity beyond being, either in the form of a timeless repose, such as nirvana, a transcendent God, or an immanent divine nature. So religious faith is not a system of belief that I'm trying to disprove in the sense of demonstrating the non-existence of eternity. What I'm calling into question is the idea that eternity is desirable. So that's sort of the first thing to notice that he's starting with. Is really is an interesting critique of this idea of this thing he calls religious faith. And we'll get him explaining a little bit more of this in some of the interviews, but I think it's helpful to just get that kind of points out a little bit more solidly. So the idea then of a secular faith would then be sort of the opposite in that the secular faith is a faith that is in something for him, which he especially has in mind projects that are necessarily finite because our lives are finite. And so anything that is a project of our lives, the things we're interested in that we want to devote time to, he's going to call that a secular faith. And the reason he uses the word faith in that context is because he wants us to keep in mind the whole point about finitude and loss, that everything we do is subject to loss. It could all be unraveled in an instant in the wrong, doing the wrong thing, crossing the street the wrong way. It could be unraveled because we suddenly discovered that what we had in mind is mistaken somehow. So we need to rethink the project that we had in mind. But this idea that what we do and what matters in life are going to be these secular faith projects. And the idea that one should live a life oriented towards eternity, I'm going to argue, is actually a little nonsensical. In that logically we can't actually construct a story to tell about what that would be because it's just too alien from what it is to be a living being. Because being alive means you're going to die. And so if you take that out of the equation, everything that is human or matters, he says, evaporates. So that's going to be important to how he talks then about freedom as the ability to address oneself to those things. So that's for him freedom, this spiritual freedom in particular. And he's going to contrast that with how animals live, that they have a style of life that is inherent to them, and they just sort of go off and do it. But humans are in the position where we can stop and ask, well, is this the thing I want to do with my time, or do I want to do something else with my time? And the fact that we have the freedom to ask that kind of question of ourselves, that's what he calls spiritual freedom. Okay. So I think that'll help to have some of those basic definitions laid out. And he'll come back over and over and try and expand on that and explain them as we go along too. And as a matter of conducting class, then I want to remind you all that while I like having the extra voices in the class especially the author to come in and explain what he or she means, the whole point of it is to make this comprehensible, to break it down. And so if you have any questions along the way, you're encouraged to interrupt. So interrupting is a good thing in this context. So because I don't want you to lose track of the question you have, because it's the whole point about it's on a tape. We can stop and start and go back, and so interrupting is is encouraged. I was going to say perfectly fine, but no, it's actively encouraged.
How do you want us to interrupt? Do you want us to just burst in or put
that's fine.
Okay.
When I'm showing the video, I may not necessarily be able to see all of you. The way that it puts the people on the side kind of thing.
Yeah.
So I may not, especially because of that, I may not see you all. So yes, just speak up.
Okay.
Say, hey, I have a question here. Okay, so with that, the first one is him talking about freedom. So let's see if I can get that started. Oh, and like I said in the video, the other thing is he's speaks with a little bit of an accent, being Swedish and all, and then he also often speaks quickly. So sometimes and that's another time when you might want to interrupt to just say, wait a second, that went by way too fast. What was he just saying? So that's ripe ground for interrupting right there. Also, and I guess I find it interesting that all of this he wrote this, and then a lot of the interviews are before COVID, and then there's some of it that gets into the COVID time, and it's just sort of kind of curious to kind of I don't know, for me, looking back at that life was different. It seems somehow. But then some of these things are still the same. Okay, here we go.
I mean, there is a traditional thinking about
He also
freedom
likes to do
as sort
this.
of like freedom from constraints. To be free would be like to be independent, as it were. That's precisely the model of freedom that I'm arguing against. I don't think it's even an intelligible idea of freedom. Now, the reason why we are essentially free, spiritual freedom myself, is that, you know, from a first person standpoint, there's always a question, irreducibly, of what you ought to do, what you ought to believe, who you ought to be. That question can't go away as long as you're an agent, you know? And it's capacity to engage that question that makes us free. But that sort of freedom doesn't make us independent of others. It makes us essentially dependent on others because, like, I always have to give some practical answer to that question, engage in activities. But whether I am actually who I'm trying to be depends on the recognition of others. You know, what those questions are comes from my social historical situation. But very importantly, this is trying to think together, both that we are like necessarily always like thrown into a social and historical world that precedes us, that we didn't invent. You know, I didn't decide, you know, someone called me Martin. I was thrown into the world. Someone took care of me. And that constrained me before I could decide anything about it. You know, but that constraint can't fully determine what I'm doing because I always have to take up those constraints. And there's always a question for me of what I ought to do and who I ought to be. And it's the capacity to engage that question that makes us free. And then there's the question about, okay, which social and historical conditions would allow us, both individually and collectively, to more fully own our responsibility for our answers to that question and our responsibility to engage that question. And that's then the sort of historical progression of freedom. Okay, I mean, part of the point of coining the term of art, socially available free time, which after all is my invention for better or worse, was precisely to shake people out of the assumption that they know what free time means. But what tends to happen instead is that people just drop the socially available and just paraphrase me as talking about free time, and then it's leisure time, and you're totally lost. Like, that's the problem. I mean, because the socially available is extremely important, because that's supposed to like remind us that like the form in which we can live out our freedom is always socially and institutionally constituted, you know? So that like for us to more fully actualize our freedom has to do with how we're socially habituated in the first place and how we are socially formed to engage that question. Because there is a dimension of freedom always, like whatever you're doing, you know, what you're doing, there's always a why, a sense of why you're doing it. Like we can't, there's no sense in which we're free. Whatever you're doing, you can always ask the question why you're doing it. And you can say like, well, because, and you can say like, well, because I have to make a living, because it's profitable. The point is that those are not very good reasons. You know, and for us to have better reason, we would have to have different social institutional forms in which we come to give answers to those questions. And our time would be more free the better reasons there were for it, you know? It's like, oh, because it is for this common social good that I recognize, or because X, Y, and Z, this is meaningful to do, because I'm committed to, even though it's hard, and even though I have to get up early in the morning. You know, then I'm more free because I can actually own the reasons for why I'm doing what I'm doing. And part of the point is, so that's all of that is baked into the socially available. It has to do with the justificatory, the institutional, social, all those things. And that's actually, and that would be true. That's actually true even when you're eating that pizza and watching that movie. The qualitative experience of that is that, like, whether you're like, you know, why are you doing this, Anthony? Why are you kicking back tonight? And it's just like, because, you know, because I'm tired, because I couldn't think of anything better to do. That's qualitatively impairs that experience compared to the moments when you can ask, you know, like, oh, because I have really made time to relax tonight in view of like the overall rhythms of my life and the way I sort of live out my commitments. It can make perfect sense and it could be affirmed as a free activity. But we all know that you can also feel like horribly sort of like unfree, deeply sunk into that couch, you know, even though you technically have leisure time. And that has to do with, because like when you ask yourself, like, why are you doing this? But I'm like, because I don't know. Like, because it's the weakest form of reason. But it shows that like the reason is always that question for us. We can't just say like, even when we would say like, oh, forget about the reason thing. It's so demanding. Like, forget about reason. You can't. And it's betrayed by just this phrase, because. You have to answer somehow. And it's just because, just because. But that's a low degree of freedom compared to like, because I want to make time to spend this evening with Alisa in our relationship and we're like eating pizza. That's a much better reason than like, just because I've forgotten even what I'm doing with my life and I can't make sense of it anymore.
Yeah, there's the language that's he'll eventually use, but is more common. Other people have developed this idea that the difference is freedom from and freedom to, and he's gonna eventually we'll get him talking about value and how we value things, and this is going to be an important part of that. But that important distinction, though, when I say that I am free, am I saying that I am free because there is a lack of constraint on me, or I'm saying I'm free because I am able to choose my own direction? And so he's wanting to emphasize, no, there are always constraints on you. So this freedom from is a mythology that doesn't really exist. You can't live that way. It's to be human is to be dependent. So what freedom really means is the freedom to pursue what it is that you intend to pursue. And here, of course, he's just contrasting that with not having any direction at all.
Richard, I know this is just the beginning of his thought process, but what about free will? You know, I mean, in my own case, sometimes I sense that I don't have control over what I'm about to do. I mean, at some level.
Yeah.
Even though outwardly, yes, I choose to do this rather than that, but I have sensed in myself an almost inability not to do it.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting. He is going to artfully avoid that question.
Okay.
And what he has, and I think it's defensible in that it's in a sense beyond what he's really talking about, because he wants us to focus on the experience of the time of the making the choices.
Right.
And so yeah, in the end, is any of this really a free process? There's a deep philosophical question there. And he's just going to say, that's not the question I'm interested in right now. So as long as you're experiencing some choice, some ability to make your own decisions, then we'll just focus on the fact that you experience that freedom.
Oh, right. Now I'm loving his approach.
I think it's just very fresh and interesting the way he comes at this. Yeah. All righty.
Yeah.
I don't remember this being so choppy when I previewed it.
Check-in time.
Okay. So I think that was just the short introduction on that, right? No. Oh yeah, okay. Oh, that was but I was doing that as a teaser on freedom. And then this gets into more substance.
Welcome, everyone. My name is Matt Crosman. I'm the Faith Initiative Director here at the GraceFarms Foundation. So glad that you could join us today. As we get started, just a few housekeeping notes. First of all, this meeting will be recorded so that we can
should have left myself a note about where to
allow
skip
them
this.
to do their work on a tour of the Society of Fellows at Harvard. And Martin has been a friend to me in just this way. I have found this book, this project, as he's been working on it, personally challenging to me, sharpening my own thoughts. He and I do not and will not in this conversation agree on everything. Hopefully that's part of the fun of the conversation. But we found it. I've found his willingness, our shared question, to be a really valuable ground for our conversation together.
What's happening?
Martin, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you. Was that too soon? I appeared on screen.
No. You appeared and I got some sort of Zoom, some sort of technology error right at that moment. And it threatened me that I might be thrown out of this call. So that seems to be an idle threat. Anyway, I'm so glad that you're here with us.
I'm so glad to be here. And thank you for that wonderful introduction. I'm super delighted to, for the first, but hopefully not the last time, come and join this community. The interactions we've had, the Yale Divinity School, the Yale Humanists, the Life Worth Living course has been great. And I'm really excited to visit today and pursue these questions in this context, which seems to me, I hope also post-COVID that I will be able to visit this place, which I hear is extraordinary in real life. But in the meantime, I'm delighted to be here on Zoom.
Yes, we need to have you on site for sure. And if I'm right, you're joining us from Sweden, is that right?
That is correct, yes.
So, I mean, there are some upsides to the weird world of COVID. The fact of your travel doesn't make it impossible for you to join us. So, I just want to dive right in. One of the sort of key categories distinctions that you draw for us in the book is this distinction between religious faith and secular faith. Now, to some folks, secular faith would just sound like a contradiction in terms, but you propose that actually all of us, even religious folks, it's not that religious faith is the sort of faith that religious people have, and secular faith is the sort of faith that secular people have. But you actually think that all of us, whether we're religious or not, and I know various ones of us on this call would identify differently in that respect, all of us actually engage in secular faith at the very least in certain ways. So could you just lay out those two categories for us?
Absolutely, great. That's a great opening. Thank you, Matt. Well, so the first thing to say, let me define, first of all, because both of those terms, secular and faith, people can have a lot of different associations to those terms. Let me first be very clear what I mean by secular, which is not restricted. I mean, in many modern discussions, we think about the separation of the church and the state and questions like that. Whereas for me, secular should be understood in terms of its Latin etymological root, where it's linked to the temporal, the historical, the worldly, more or less the way St. Augustine used the term, secularis, as designating all those things which depend for their existence on historical, temporal, social practices. All of those things are secular. So as Augustine reminded us, we all live in a secular world in that sense, because we all live in historical, socially shared, temporal world, right? So that's the notion of the secular we're talking about here. And the reason I'm pairing that with faith is that faith here meaning not really being linked to any form of practical commitment that we have. I mean, if you think about it, people often are so surprised first when I talk about faith, and they're like, as if that's an exclusively religious category, but we only have to think about everyday language. The way we talk about being faithful, keeping faith with something, being unfaithful, these questions of fidelity and betrayal are at stake in all aspects of our lives. It's sort of built into that us, and that has to do with that, when we're committed to something, or as we also say, when we believe in something, when we're devoted to something, we can't just be committed. We have to keep faith with that to which we are committed. Apologies, I've been speaking Swedish a lot recently, so my English might be not. And built into that is that we can lose faith, we can be unfaithful, we can betray that to which we're committed. So those, the stakes of that. So really, that's also why, as you helpfully recall, I argue that on the most fundamental level, everyone practices secular faith because, whatever you believe in, like the society you're trying to contribute to and be a part of, the vocation to which you're committed, all of those things don't just exist independently of us believing in them and keeping faith with them. They only exist through the way we uphold them through our practices socially. Like the very community that I'm visiting today, it's not like that just exists there. The physical space might just be there, even if we all drop dead. But the community that you care about only lives through the practice of us coming together, talking, having these conversations, holding each other accountable, all of those things. That's a practice of secular faith in my sense, because the object of faith does not exist independently of the practice. You know, you can't like even it essentially depends on us sustaining it, and that's a social, material, social, historical, temporal practice, hence secular. So that's the idea. We can talk more about that, but just to lay out why that's, you know, the form of all commitments, the form of all practices has a sort of dynamic of secular faith, because it's something that like we have to uphold on pain of the risk of losing it or betraying it if we fail to uphold it or allow it to be perverted or distorted and so on. Yeah. This looks like you want to interrupt me there because I go on and on here. Yeah.
No, this is great. But then, and you were just starting to sort of run into this, but you then argue that actually religious faith can end up being a sort of threat to the secular faith that actually grounds our lives and makes them meaningful. I wonder if you want to describe that sort of what you take religious faith to be and how it becomes potentially a threat to this existential secular faith.
Right. Absolutely. And I want to be careful here. And this is one of the sort of hopes I have and what I'm excited to be coming to this community today. I just want to be careful exactly about how this argument is laid out, because first of all, in light of that, we can say, you know, I also want to show that a lot of things we think depend on religious faith actually in practice can be better understood as secular. Lots of the ways in which historically and in our contemporary times, religious communities, churches, other things have created and maintained important social communities committed to social causes and that. But you know, but what I call religious faith is the idea that ultimately the ultimate object of faith, or the highest good, is something that exists independently of our practical devotion to it, you know, and so that's one part of it. And the other part of it has to do with that, the sense that even though in this life, on this earth, we are subject to those secular conditions of time and history and fragility and mortality, the highest good, the best state of things would be to ultimately be released from that, you know. So the ultimate end is to be released from having to practice faith in the secular sense and just say, be in the presence of God or repose in nirvana, stoic apathy. I mean, there are many versions of it. So that's the first stab, but we can disentangle all of this.
Yeah. So as I said, sort of in some of my framing, that actually is a really interesting proposal, especially in this moment when so many of us are wrestling with this like really direct sort of encounter with our own fragility and the fragility of so many people and institutions and whatever else it might be that we really care about. But you sort of turn it on its head, that the potential of loss then isn't a threat to our care. It's actually part of what it means to care. I wonder if you could just tell us a bit about that. It's a bit counterintuitive.
Absolutely.
Yeah, this is the part that really is sort of, I think, really radical and innovative about what he's doing is to come at the question from this direction, that it is the fact of finitude that makes anything meaningful. You don't have meaning without that finitude. It's a really radical idea.
Absolutely, great. So and that is linked to this key concept for all of you here of flourishing. You know, we'll come to that too. But so the idea is that even what it is to be alive and distinguishes living beings, you know, is that you have to maintain yourself, that you have to sustain yourself, and that's again a sort of practice, and that if what you cared about could not be lost, could not be betrayed, could not be violated, was not fragile, it would not call out for your care. You know, it would be possible to understand in practice why it's important that you care for it and what's at stake in that care. So I'm not, of course, denying that fragility and mortality is also difficult and painful to bear, but I want to show that it is at the same time irreducibly what animates us and what makes our actions matter and what sort of from within puts our lives and our actions at stake. So instead of trying to think of the highest good as something that would relieve us from that fragility, it's rather about like actualizing a form of life that would allow us to deepen that care and flourish in our mortality and fragility in better ways.
Yeah. So then how should we relate to this prospect of loss? Because you're sort of carving out an interesting space between, you say we shouldn't try to secure ourselves against it, which you say many sort of what you call religious faith tries to do by saying, well, I'm secure against loss because I can lose something in this life. You engage with C.S. Lewis on this. But maybe I can say that what really matters to me most is something that's promised to me in the ever after. So you don't say we shouldn't do that, but you also say we shouldn't just give ourselves over to it either, because that would mean that we no longer are really relating to it as loss. That would be another way of sort of giving up on care.
Yes,
exactly. You're trying to sort of like thread a space, like how, and I think it's really practical for a lot of us in our lives.
Absolutely.
Right now. How should we relate to sort of the fragility of life, the threats that we face to the things and the people that we care about most in the world?
He doesn't actually reference existential philosophers, which I find kind of interesting. But what he's talking about here is clearly an idea that Albert Camus developed that about the absurd, that you choose to live and to engage the projects of your life in spite of the fact that they're going to eventually fall apart. That they will die, you will die, in history, that it will all come to an end. And that's just absurd that we, in some sense, we devote ourselves to something we know has to eventually have an end. But Camus is saying that's what living is rebelling against the absurdity of that. So it's interesting. He obviously knows these people, but it's curious how he just comes up with his own way of phrasing this and just sort of sweeps by without mentioning that. Well, here's someone who had this idea here, and here's someone who had this idea here, which is what a lot of academics would do, and it does bog down a lot of academic writing. And so I think he clearly, had in mind that there was a broader audience here, and so he's specifically avoiding that kind of, like intellectual history to establish his idea. He just says, "Here's my idea." So, but they're not all entirely new. They're just his version of them is very new.
Great. Yeah, that's wonderful. So let me first, because highlight one thing in what you said, which is very important to the book. And again, it's on the sort of level of definition, but it's important because people can have very different understandings of these terms. So what I'm calling various forms of religious ideals, their common denominator is the idea that the highest good would be to be absolved from pain and loss, anxiety, fragility. And that's why it can take the form of an idea of something like, an eternal ever after or nirvana, but it can also have this sort of stoic ideal of just like giving up on the care and passions in this life that makes me vulnerable, and the idea that the best state would be a sort of tranquility imminently. So it can be an imminent ideal of being absolved from pain and loss, or a transcendent one. But in both cases, it denies, loses sight of this constitutive condition.
Here, imminent, sort of meaning in this life. So the Stoics from ancient Greece and Rome had this philosophy: you just sort of withdraw from the world because it's all too chaotic and weird. And he's rejecting that as much as he rejects a transcendent avoiding of that, which is so the transcendent being the Buddhist nirvana or a Christian construction of heaven. So imminent, transcendent, just want to define those terms.
That actually, you can't have the sense of the preciousness of the good without the threat of the bad. You can't have flourishing without the possibility of withering. You can't have well-being without the threat of pain. And these things go together, and we have to learn to live with that co-implication. Yeah. So, and we can come to the sort of more, I absolutely agree with you that the practical question is important, but I also just want to see often so many theoretical assumptions about, what we're striving for sort of informed by question in advance. I want to clear that first.
Yeah. Well, that's good. And it strikes me as I read that you're really encouraging us to to stare the possibility of loss in the face. And I think, forgive me, this may not be a word that you use, but almost sort of, you have to sort of like rage against that reality, even
rebellion.
as we know that in some ways it's inevitability, and in that sort of struggle. So we're not aiming at a state that we're trying to get to. It's always a process of this sort of resistance of what we know is inevitable, which is the loss of what we care about so profoundly. Is that?
Yes, absolutely. That's very helpful. You can also spin it sort of the positive way, saying that like our commitment to flourishing, and for that which we love to flourish, and that because that's the positive animating direction, does not aim at a final state, but because flourishing is an activity. The old Aristotelian insight, that like flourishing is an activity, and not at least as church-going people know, it's a social activity. It's it's something you come together and do, and that can't come to an end. Once the end would be death. So we're not aiming at an end, a state for it for the activities to cease. We're seeking to maintain the activity, deepen it, making it flourish in the best possible way. That's the sort of animating movement. But then the point is just that, like, unless that animation was haunted from within by the sense that, like, we could wither, the activity could cease, this could fall apart, this could turn bad, we couldn't have a sense of the good and the flourishing. But it's important that it's not good because it's going to be lost, because then everything would be good, because everything's going to be lost. It's rather that, like, within the sense, because what we're committed to is the flourishing, the notion of the good. It's just that the good is not this, even its highest form, is not this something exempt from the risk of loss. It's like built into the goodness of the good is that risk.
Yeah. So the Greeks even, like, so for like Plato, the good would be better. The good would be better if it were eternally secured. But for you argue quite to the contrary. It would lose some of its goodness if it were.
It wouldn't be
secure.
Actually, because and in work I'm doing now, which on sort of the notion of the soul and the good, explicitly flourishing, I'm really trying to radicalize what's this Aristotelian insight. I mean, the highest good is an activity. Being is an activity, and as soon as you see that, then you can start showing that activity must run the risk of falling apart for it to sort of like be a self-maintaining activity.
Yeah. All right. Well, now we've perhaps gotten to the place where we can start introducing theological questions. And let me just say to our audience, GraceFarms, the Faith Initiative isn't invested in any particular faith tradition. And in fact, we understand our question to be, just as I hope we're already experiencing this conversation, our question is one that's relevant to both religious folks and folks that wouldn't identify as religious. But I want to bring in some of the religious sort of claims or the theological claims that you make in this book, because I think they're really interesting. Often when I introduce your project to people, I'll start with this sort of provocative framing, which I think comes directly from you. You say at some point, most honest theologians will tell you that they cannot prove that God does exist. They think, however, that they can make a case that you should hope that God does exist and invite you to inhabit a world in which God does exist. You say, similarly, I cannot convince you that God does not exist. But I think I can convince you that you should hope for your own sake that God does not exist. And I take it that at least one of the key reasons there is that if God does exist, at least as many have imagined God, and that's where we'll have some conversation, fun. But at least as many have imagined God, God might be precisely that sort of eternally secured good that actually sort of sucks all of the meaning out of life, because it suddenly becomes impossible to care in the sort of dynamic way that you're talking about. I wonder if you could just share a bit about, what is it about particular ways, at least, of thinking about God that would really make it hard for us to be invested in flourishing in the ways that we ought to be.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm most excited to have this conversation now, because in some of my current work, I think I'm moving further also towards this sort of like secular notion of the divine and God and so on. So it'd be very interesting to talk about that. But, you know, if we conceive of God and the divine as some sort of eternal being or eternal repose, or like what I'm trying to show there is that, such a God precisely could not care, because to care you have to be susceptible to loss and so on, as we talked about. Similarly, if we attain such an eternal state, like our lives would be over. I mean, this is sort of these notions of the eternal Sabbath or the cosmic Sabbath or nirvana. All those are notions that it's not accidental that they describe a sort of state where like you can just be and you don't have to do anything. But that's sort of conceptually inseparable from death. And I want to like really push on that, not just because we can't understand it, because that's the wrong way of thinking about the good. That's why you can't separate it from death and nothing, because it's not the right way of thinking about being and the good. And then I think we can come to this a little later today, that in light of that, one can also start making sense of how we talk about God in a way that actually is about our life together. And that has to do with the reading of Hegel that I know you wanted to talk about. Yeah. We'll get there later. But for now, we can just say, like, insofar as, because I want to be clear on this too, like, God and the divine can mean very many different things. But insofar as there's any variation on the idea that, like, the highest good is either an eternal being or an eternal state of being or an eternal Sabbath or nirvana and so on, then that's the sort of idea that I'm criticizing. Instead of seeing that as the highest good, we should see the divine or the highest good, not as above or beyond us, but as between us, in the social practices that we sustain. That's in a way the secularization of the divine that I'm trying to pursue when I'm trying to show the resource within religious traditions. So like, where is the love? Like, not vertically, but here. Where is the responsibility? Not here, but here. And I want to show, like, in a way, that's what many religious people in communities already know in practice, but I sort of want to raise that to self-consciousness and give resources to affirm that's where the divine is in our idea of the good as the social conception of the good that we're committed to sustaining and hold ourselves to. That's where it is.
Yeah, I mean, it actually maybe ironically reminds me of a saying of Jesus, in which he said, the kingdom of God, you will not say here it is or there it is. Rather, the kingdom of God, the rule of God, the highest good, God and creation at home with one another is among you. And you and I have talked about this before, but I found myself again thinking as I was reading, what about this Christian idea of kenosis, which you take up, which is this idea that God has God's self invested. God's self. Forgive me for the theological language. I try not to use gendered language for God. God has invested God's self in the temporal, spatial unfolding of the world. In ways that subject God to the possibility of loss, in ways that subject, it made me think about the theology of someone like Moltmann, who would be another sort of Hegelian, sort of inflected, but Moltmann saw no sort of
Jürgen Moltmann, important Lutheran theologian, died, I think, just a couple of years ago.
Conflict with. We'll get to Hegel in a second. But for Moltmann, this was not a sort of high-minded sort of religion beyond revelation. This is, in fact, the substance of the revelation. Moltmann thought, because the substance of the revelation is perhaps encapsulated in something like we get in John 1, right? That the Word of God has tabernacled among us. That this is in fact even more than just tabernacle. That's emphasizes sort of the fact this is temporary, right? But the whole of the story is about God making the world becoming a home, becoming the home of God, and the world finding its home in being at home with God, and this really tight sort of connection between the world and God. Are there possibilities there for sort of finding some sort of common ground between this sort of secular this Christian project?
Absolutely. I mean, I'm so glad you bring this up, because this is like where, I mean, towards the end of the book, I go there explicitly, but then in the base of the book, they become the most productive when you route it through this thing. So I hope we can explore some of those things yesterday. So, and, you know, and already what you said about kenosis, and I'm sure lots of people know this here, like in Luther's translation of the Bible, you know, when he uses the term Entäußerung in German, it's precisely like he wants to convey this thought that like God out of love empties himself out in the world. That's the emptying out in the world. That's the incarnation. And the question is just like how we should understand this, how we should read this, and what it says about us and our notion of the divine. And on the sort of Hegelian understanding of religion that I'm trying to develop, granting that one can understand Hegel in many different ways, so I'm just going to explain what I mean by the Hegelian understanding, is that then, like, you know,
GWF Hegel, important German philosopher, died, I think, 1804, something like that. But Hegel's going to come back in here. Hegel's was a very deep thinker, and Haggland has a really interesting reading on him. So we'll come back to talking about Hegel a couple different times.
The divine has always actually been a name for the sort of form of social life to which we are committed, the norms to which we hold one another, and through the notion of the divine, we're trying to make sense of our obligations to one another, our relation to the world, and so on. And that's why, like, maybe in an early stage, like, God is the sun, because we seem to be completely dependent on the sun for our lives, and then Christianity plays an important part there, because Hegel sees that it's the last step before, like, the full philosophical understanding of ourselves, because precisely because of this notion of incarnation, that, like, through the incarnation and death of Jesus, like, there's a sense of, like, the divine actually, to be divine and to be something that is capable of love and worthy of being loved, must become mortal. And then the crucial difference between what I would call the religious and the secular interpretation is that on the religious interpretation, however varied, at the end of the day, the mortality of the divine has to be a transitional stage, such that, like, God descends into the mortal to redeem us from it and then ascends from it, you know? Whereas the secular point I want to push with Hegel is that, like, no, what this really tells us representationally is that even the highest good, the mortal, must be something that lives and dies through our historical existence, that only lives on or is resurrected because we remember it, hold ourselves to it, but that is inseparable from that practice, and thereby, like, allowing us to see that, like, the divine or God is really a name for sort of what our social notion of the good, what is worth doing, what is worthy of our devotion, and thereby, like, the divine can be repressive or liberating depending on those norms. But the full secular self-consciousness is that, like, that's what it's about. And the more we recognize that, the more we can take full responsibility for that. And that would be, like, not an external critique of religion, but, like, fulfilling its sort of social mission from within. But that goes very fast. I'm happy to.
No, it's helpful. I think when we
I mean, what he's really kind of arguing with is the most dramatic version of it is called Buddhist quietism, and which is the idea that because the Buddhist is pursuing this state of nirvana in which the ego is transcended, nothing really nothing in the material world matters, and so there are classical forms of Buddhism that just seem to not even care about ethics because it just doesn't matter. It's not, it all ends and something else that's more important is going to exist. And Haggland makes the same kind of comment talking about Christianity and Christian ideas, constructions of heaven. Let me see if I can find it real quick. That, you know, if what you're devoted to is this infinity that is beyond our finitude, then you can't really get too excited about things like global warming, or even war. You know, it's just that it's if the world doesn't fundamentally matter, then you're in this weird place where, well, well, wait a second. I mean, what are you doing with your life then if that's not what matters? And so people like Moltmann, who's Protestant, and Protestantism tends a little bit more towards that quietism than Catholicism. That Catholicism early on adopted a social gospel, and the in my thinking anyway, the best Protestant theologians are the ones who are finding an important way back to emphasizing social engagement as somehow vital to the whole project, that it's not the transcendent that matters, it's the immanent, it's what you're doing with your life here and now that matters. And those people tend also to be embracing some version of existentialism. And Moltmann's a good example of that. There's another German theologian very similar named Bultmann, has some related ideas. And the most famous is probably a guy named Paul Tillich, who died as an American I think he died in 1965, but came here just before World War II to escape the Nazis, which shows the point of his social engagements. It was attracting enough attention. He had to flee Germany and the power. So it's a tension that religious thinkers have been aware of, that if what we're saying matters is this transcendent thing that's beyond our world, then how do we actually, what's the justification for claiming that anything in this world really matters? So anyway, so he's coming at that really sort of head on to say, yeah, if that's what you're saying, then yeah, it doesn't matter. That's why you need to have the secular faith, the finitude. It needs to be rooted in finitude. Did someone have a question about that? Oh, okay. All right. Get going here.
We talked with my undergraduates this past spring. I think I proposed to them that they might understand part of what you're doing is you're sort of you're suggesting that Jesus is calling them to sort of leave behind their religious faith in a certain sense, right? Just because of what you said, just to highlight what you said, that the way you see it is there's actually you're not trying to sort of critique religion as you are trying to affirm. It's an immanent critique. It's a critique from the inside, sort of affirm the goals of the religious move, and here in this case, specifically Christian sort of insight about the unity, about the way that the good is fundamentally incarnated, is fundamentally sort of entangled in the flow of history. You think that you can deliver better on those goods than some of those, than the sort of traditional theological ways of describing life.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right.
Maybe I had a question about that, or I just wanted to...
No, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say on that note, because recently I'm just now finishing this response essay to sort of the debates around the argument about religion in the book. And one thing I've been thinking a lot about recently, directly related to this. So Brandon Terry, who's a Martin Luther King scholar at Harvard, wrote a very beautiful essay on my book, and where he comes along a long way in this sort of secular understanding of religious language. But then he asked this question about, like, well, one thing that was really important to King and other civil rights people was the sense that, like, even when you're like really deserted, like God is with you, and he's like, so what can you do with that? Okay, I can buy this, that we don't need the eternity, but that sense that there's that even in your darkest hour, you are not deserted, God is with you. And I felt very interpolated by that. I thought it was a very good way of zoning in on an important issue. So one thing I'm trying to do in the response, and this is in line with the book, is that the immanent critique of that is to affirm the normative commitment, because one of the things we're saying to ourselves when we're saying that, we're holding that as an ideal, is that committing ourselves to a form of life or society where even when you fall down and crash down, there's actually something you can rely on and that keeps you up. But that's the promise of a sort of form of social life that we would sustain and that would actually be embodied in our institutions and practices, what I'm calling democratic socialism, where that sort of trust could actually be grounded in our social relations, and it wouldn't be dependent on my psychological faith that there is some supernatural entity who cares for me. What we're really longing for in that is a form of life where there are good reasons to trust that just through
way we actually sustain our lives embodied historically, socially. Yeah.
So what he means there is that the short answer is he wants to create a world in which it's not necessary for people to feel like they need the comfort that King was talking about of the comfort of God when you're feeling all alone. He wants to create a world where no one ever feels that way, so you don't have to invoke God as the solution to that feeling. Okay, we're about out of time for this week. Anybody have any comments or questions before I let you go? Okay. I think, Joanna, you had a question, but you're going to have to unmute.
Oh, thank you. Well, did I catch correctly that he was sort of saying that Jesus was a representation of the mortality concept?
Well, they talked about a couple different things. I mean, it started with Jesus talking about the kingdom of God is around you, is among
Right, within.
Yeah.
There is a quote, the kingdom is within, in the Bible.
Yeah. So, okay, but that's not quite what you were asking.
No, did he connect mortality with, I mean, I thought I heard him talk like God came down to earth,
Oh, right.
via the myth in order, and he takes from that, the mortality aspect is important. Or
Right. Yes.
Jesus told us that the mortality was important.
Well, on more directly, it becomes an important theological construct in Christianity that God is participating in this world.
Oh, okay.
Through Jesus. And so you can talk. So it gives, and this is actually where the Catholic social gospel sort of gets going is that thinking. Well, clearly this world has to matter because God was investing a son in this world. So therefore we should pay attention to this world. So there are ways that religious people have come back to emphasizing how they should pay attention to this world. He just wants us to notice the bigger issue as well, but if it doesn't ultimately matter, what do you do with that? Which again comes up mostly in extreme circumstances, like with fundamentalists, not with most mainstream Christians. But it's just sort of there as an intellectual construct, though, that needs to be
right.
Somehow or another. And for him, it becomes a point of attack.
That's interesting. Yeah.
All right.
I keep thinking about these social projects. We'll call them the projects that he talks about being built into the finite.
Mm-hmm.
So many of them are ongoing. You think about organizations that are secular organizations that have been around for many, many years, and that people who get into wanting to perpetuate those finite constructions. And so they continue for generation after generation. So I see parallels between the religion and these types of concepts and organizations, whether they be preserving the environment or the KKK, if you want to take it to that other extreme, the other end of the spectrum.
So, but yeah, it's just what he wants us to emphasize in thinking about it is that they're, even though they can transcend us, they're still finite. When you're talking, I came up with my example in my head was the Red Cross, right? So Red Cross is very old. It's gone through a number of generations of people who help sustain it, but there will be a time when it doesn't exist because it's just in the nature of the world that things will all end. Now it may last for a really, 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 really long time, or maybe not. But it's in the fact that we don't know, we can't know. We just can commit to trying to preserve it and trying to extend it.
Have faith that it will do the right thing.
We imbue our faith in it in order to try to preserve it and extend it, even though, especially because we know we need to do that in order to keep it going. If no one did that, it wouldn't keep going.
And so he views religion that regardless of what sect or belief it is, it will continue despite.
Right. It would be a religious focus would be on this thing that is infinite, that can't end by definition. Nirvana, God, heaven, they're defined as not ending. And that's the point. That primary distinction.
They could in fact end.
Well, how would you
Christianity could.
Christianity, yes, but God is defined as an eternal being. It's in the definition. So that it's that kind of thing that if that's where your faith is, then your faith is not with the thing that is finite, that requires your attention to sustain it. God doesn't require our attention to sustain God. God will just be on that idea, regardless of what we do.
So the distinction is the potential reality is Christianity could end, but the belief system says God will never end.
Right.
Yeah. I have a request. I really like the part about where we discuss. Can we leave a little bit more time at the end of the hour for questions and your take on things?
Definitely.
I'm always interested in your take on things.
Okay. I will incorporate that plan.
Thank you.
No problem. All right, everybody. Thanks for coming to class. We'll see you next week.
Thank you.
I can figure out how to end this. All right, here we go. Bye.